Daniel Carter had always known his father Richard to be a cautious and pragmatic man. A self-made entrepreneur, Richard built his wealth from the ground up, turning a small real estate business into a thriving empire over the course of several decades. He had always been careful with his decisions, particularly when it came to business and finances. That's why, when he suddenly married Vanessa, a woman nearly half his age, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Vanessa had entered their lives unexpectedly, appearing out of nowhere just over a year ago. She was beautiful, charming, and always dressed as though she had stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. She carried herself with confidence, and from the moment Richard introduced her, it was clear she knew how to win people over. At first, Daniel had given her the benefit of the doubt. His father had been alone for years after his mother's passing, and perhaps he was just looking for companionship. Still, something about Vanessa never quite sat right with him. Richard had met her at an exclusive charity event in New York, one of those black-tie affairs where wealthy elites gathered to sip champagne and bid on expensive artwork they didn't need. Vanessa had been a model and aspiring businesswoman. At least, that's what she claimed. She spoke of her dreams of opening a luxury wellness spa, of her passion for fine art and philanthropy, but she never seemed to have any concrete plans or actual investments. What she did have, however, was an undeniable ability to make people believe in her charm. Their whirlwind romance took everyone by surprise. Within months, Richard was bringing her to family gatherings, taking her on lavish trips to Europe, and showering her with extravagant gifts. Daniel had watched from the sidelines, uneasy but unwilling to interfere. His father was a grown man, and while he found the relationship suspicious, there was little he could do. Then, out of the blue, came the wedding. It was a small private ceremony, so private that even Daniel wasn't invited. He had received a phone call from his father one evening, casually informing him that he and Vanessa had gotten married the day before, in a quiet courthouse ceremony. No grand celebration, no prenup discussions, nothing. Just a quick signature on paper, and suddenly, Vanessa was now Miss Carter. Daniel had been furious. Not only had his father completely disregarded his feelings, but he had also made a massive financial decision without consulting anyone. It wasn't like Richard. He had always been meticulous about legal matters, and this rushed wedding felt completely out of character. But every time Daniel voiced his concerns, Richard brushed them off, claiming that at his age, he didn't want to waste time on formalities. He wanted to be happy, and Vanessa made him happy. 6 months later, Richard was dead. It happened so suddenly that Daniel barely had time to process it. One morning, his father simply collapsed in his home office. A heart attack, the doctors said. No prior symptoms, no warning signs. One minute he was there, and the next he was gone. The funeral was a blur. Friends, family, and business associates came to pay their respects, but Daniel barely registered their words. He was too overwhelmed by grief and the gnawing suspicion that something wasn't right. Vanessa, however, played the role of the devastated widow perfectly. Dressed in an elegant black dress, she wept dramatically, clinging to Daniel's arm as if she were the most heartbroken person in the world. "She's putting on a show," Daniel's aunt whispered to him at the wake. "Mark my words, she's already thinking about what she's getting out of this." Daniel didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't ignore how quickly Vanessa moved after Richard's death. The very next day, she started making changes, talking about rearranging things in the mansion, suggesting they go through Richard's belongings, and even discussing potential sales of assets. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment. Then came the final straw. A week after the funeral, Vanessa called Daniel to a meeting at the Carter family mansion. He hadn't been inside since his father's passing, and stepping through the grand oak doors without Richard there felt wrong. The house, which had once been filled with warmth, now felt eerily cold. Vanessa was already waiting for him in the living room, lounging on one of the designer sofas with a glass of wine in hand. "I think we should talk about the estate," she said smoothly, as if she were discussing the weather. "There are some things we need to sort out." Daniel frowned. "Sort out?" "Well, now that Richard is gone, I suppose it's time to figure out how we're handling everything. The house, the businesses, the accounts. I assume you'll be helping with the legal side of things." Daniel felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. Helping with what, exactly? Vanessa tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Well, as his wife, I assume everything is coming to me. That's how these things work, isn't it?" Daniel let out a dry laugh. "Is that what you think?" She narrowed her eyes. "It's not about what I think, Daniel. It's about the law. Richard was my husband. Legally, that makes me his beneficiary." For the first time since his father's death, Daniel felt a strange sense of clarity. He had been so consumed by grief that he hadn't even considered the legal side of things. But now, staring at Vanessa, he realized something important. His father had never been careless with his wealth. He had built his empire with careful planning and strategic decisions. Would he really have left everything unprotected? Vanessa took another sip of wine, watching him closely. "I know you're upset. I understand. But Richard wanted me to have a good life, and since he's gone, well, it's only fair that I take care of what he left behind." Daniel stood up abruptly. "We'll see about that." Vanessa's smug expression faltered. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm going to talk to my father's lawyer." For the first time since their conversation started, Vanessa looked genuinely uneasy. She tried to mask it with a small, amused smile, but Daniel could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Of course," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "Do whatever you need to do. But I think you'll find that I'm right." Daniel didn't bother responding. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked out of the mansion, his heart pounding. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he had a gut feeling that Vanessa was in for a rude awakening. And he was right. Daniel didn't waste any time. The moment he walked out of his father's mansion, he pulled out his phone and called Richard's longtime attorney, Thomas Hawthorne. Mr. Hawthorne had handled all of Richard's legal affairs for as long as Daniel could remember. If there was anyone who could shed light on what was really going on with the estate, it was him. When the lawyer answered, his tone was somber yet professional. He had already heard about Richard's passing and offered Daniel his condolences before Daniel even had a chance to explain why he was calling. But as soon as Daniel mentioned Vanessa and her claims of inheritance, there was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "I was wondering when you'd call about that," Mr. Hawthorne finally said. "We need to meet. There are some things you should know." Daniel agreed immediately, setting up a meeting for the next afternoon at Hawthorne's downtown office. He barely slept that night, his mind racing with possibilities. His father had always been cautious with his wealth. He wouldn't have left everything up to chance. And yet, Vanessa was acting as if she already had it all in her hands. The next day, Daniel arrived at the law firm's office, a sleek, modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Mr. Hawthorne greeted him with a firm handshake before leading him into a private conference room. A thick folder sat on the polished wooden table, and Daniel's stomach twisted as he realized it contained the answers he was looking for. "I'll be direct with you, Daniel," Hawthorne said as they sat down. "Your father was a smart man. He knew what he was doing when it came to his estate, and he made sure to protect it." Daniel felt a mix of relief and anticipation. "So, Vanessa doesn't actually inherit everything." Hawthorne let out a quiet chuckle. "Not even close." He opened the folder and pulled out a document. "This is your father's last will and testament. It was updated a year before he married Vanessa. At that time, he made a few key changes." Daniel leaned forward, scanning the document as Hawthorne pointed out the relevant sections. "First," the lawyer continued, "the bulk of your father's assets, including this very building, his investment properties, and his business holdings, were placed into a trust. That trust is in your name, Daniel. You are the sole beneficiary." Daniel blinked. "Wait, so it's not even technically part of his estate?" "Exactly," Hawthorne confirmed. "Because of the way the trust is structured, it was never subject to probate. That means Vanessa has no legal claim to it whatsoever. Daniel exhaled sharply, feeling an immense weight lift off his shoulders. But then another thought hit him. What about the house? She's still living there, acting like she owns it. Hawthorne flipped a few pages. The mansion was also transferred into the trust 2 years ago. It was never in your father's name at the time of his death, which means it doesn't pass through his estate either. Vanessa is essentially squatting. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. No wonder Vanessa had been so vague when he asked about the will. She had no idea she was sitting in a house that legally wasn't hers. But what about whatever's left in the estate? Daniel asked. She said something about being his legal wife and having a claim. Hawthorne nodded. She is entitled to something, but not as much as she thinks. Your father did leave a provision for her. A small trust fund that would have provided for her if they had remained married for at least 5 years. Since they were only married for 6 months, that clause is void. Daniel smirked. So she gets nothing? Not necessarily nothing, Hawthorne clarified. She may still have a claim to any personal assets that were solely in your father's name at the time of his death. That includes his personal bank accounts and any valuables not placed into the trust. But, compared to what she was expecting, it's a pittance. Daniel sat back in his chair, processing everything. His father had truly been one step ahead. He must have suspected, at least on some level, that Vanessa wasn't with him for the right reasons. Otherwise, why would he have structured his assets this way? Does she even know any of this? Daniel asked. Hawthorne shook his head. Not yet. She hasn't officially contacted me. I assume she was waiting to see if she could take control first. But when she does, she's in for a rude awakening. Daniel couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. Vanessa had waltzed into their lives expecting to walk away with everything. Instead, she was about to find out she had no real claim at all. As he left the law office, Daniel knew he had a decision to make. He could wait for Vanessa to come to her own realization, or he could confront her with the truth himself. Given how aggressively she was already acting, he doubted she would take it well. By the time he arrived back at his apartment, he had made up his mind. He was going to tell her, and he was going to enjoy watching her reaction. The next morning, Daniel returned to the mansion, walking in without knocking. He still had a key, and legally this was his house, not Vanessa's. He found her in the dining room, sipping coffee like she didn't have a care in the world. "You should start packing," Daniel said, leaning against the doorframe. Vanessa looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "This house doesn't belong to you," he continued. "Neither does my father's business or most of his money. You were married to him for 6 months. Legally, that means nothing." She scoffed, setting down her cup. "Daniel, I don't have time for your tantrums. I already told you. I'm his wife. That makes me his heir." Daniel smiled. "That's what you thought. But Dad put everything into a trust, and guess what? That trust belongs to me." The color drained from Vanessa's face. That's not possible." "Oh, it's very possible," Daniel said. "Dad made sure of it long before you came along." She stood up, her composure slipping. "That can't be legal. I'm his wife." Daniel shrugged. "You were for half a year, but the will says you needed to be married to him for at least 5 years to get anything significant, and even then it wouldn't have been much." Vanessa's mouth opened and closed, as if she were trying to find the right argument. But there was no argument. She had bet everything on inheriting a fortune, and now she had nothing. "You're lying," she finally hissed. "I'll sue. I'll challenge the will. You won't get away with this." Daniel laughed. "Go ahead, but you won't be challenging a will, you'll be challenging a trust, and you'll lose." Vanessa's hands clenched into fists. For the first time since Richard's death, she wasn't the confident, manipulative woman she had been. She was desperate. Daniel turned toward the door. "You have a week to move out. After that, I'll have you evicted." He didn't wait for her response. He had won, and there was nothing she could do about it. Vanessa didn't take the news well. For the first few days after Daniel confronted her, she refused to believe it. She stayed in the mansion as if nothing had changed, convinced that there had to be some mistake, some legal loophole that would still give her what she wanted. She made phone calls to lawyers, financial advisors, anyone she thought could help her. But the more she dug, the worse it got for her. Daniel received his first legal notice 3 days later. It was a formal letter from a high-profile law firm stating that Vanessa intended to contest the estate. She was claiming spousal rights and arguing that Richard's financial decisions had unfairly deprived her of her rightful inheritance. The letter also accused Daniel of undue influence, suggesting that he had manipulated his father into placing assets in a trust to cut Vanessa out. Daniel rolled his eyes as he read it. He had expected Vanessa to fight back, but he wasn't worried. She had no case. Still, he forwarded the letter to Mr. Hawthorne, who called him later that evening. "She's grasping at straws," Hawthorne said, sounding unimpressed. "She's arguing spousal inheritance laws, but those don't apply to assets that were already in a trust before Richard died. And as for undue influence," he let out a small chuckle, "your father transferred his assets before he even met her. She has no argument." "So what happens now?" Daniel asked. "She can still file a lawsuit," Hawthorne admitted, "and she probably will. But trust litigation is expensive, and without solid evidence, she's unlikely to get far. My guess, she's hoping you'll offer her a settlement to make her go away." Daniel exhaled. He had no intention of giving Vanessa anything, but he also didn't want a long, drawn-out legal battle. "What are our options?" "We could file for a motion to dismiss if she officially sues," Hawthorne said. "Or, if you're feeling generous, we could offer her a small settlement just to end things quickly." Daniel didn't even hesitate. "No settlement, she doesn't deserve a cent." Hawthorne chuckled again. "I figured you'd say that. In that case, let's wait and see if she actually follows through with the lawsuit." And follow through she did. A week later, Vanessa officially filed a lawsuit against Daniel and the Carter Trust. She claimed that Richard had been mentally impaired when he transferred his assets, and that Daniel had pressured him into doing so. She argued that, as Richard's wife, she had a legal right to his estate, and that the trust should be dissolved so that she could claim her fair share. Daniel was furious, but Hawthorne remained calm. "This was predictable," he assured Daniel. "She has no evidence. Her only hope is dragging this out long enough to make you uncomfortable." And that was exactly what Vanessa tried to do. For the next few months, she did everything she could to make Daniel's life difficult. She refused to leave the mansion, forcing Daniel to file an eviction notice. She made public statements to the press, painting herself as a grieving widow who had been cruelly pushed out by her greedy stepson. She gave interviews, crying on camera about how much she had loved Richard, and how devastated she was to be betrayed. "She's good," Daniel admitted to his aunt over dinner one night, watching a clip of Vanessa's latest TV interview. "She should have been an actress." His aunt snorted. "She's a gold digger, Daniel. Don't let it get to you." He tried not to, but it was frustrating to watch. Vanessa had known exactly what she was doing when she married Richard, and now she was playing the victim. Worse, some people were actually buying it. The media loved a scandal, and Vanessa's dramatic sob story made for good headlines. But Daniel knew the truth, and so did the court. As the case progressed, Vanessa's arguments fell apart quickly. The trust documents were airtight, and there was no evidence that Richard had been mentally impaired when he created them. Medical records showed that he had been in perfect health at the time, and multiple witnesses, including Richard's business partners, testified that he had always been meticulous about his finances. There was nothing suspicious about his decision to protect his assets. Vanessa's own financial records didn't help her case either. Under cross-examination, she was forced to admit that she had encouraged Richard to make large withdrawals from his personal accounts in the months before his death. Withdrawals that coincidentally lined up with extravagant purchases she had made, jewelry, vacations, luxury shopping sprees. It became clear to the court that Vanessa had expected to inherit everything and had been spending Richard's money freely under that assumption. When confronted with this evidence, Vanessa tried to claim that Richard had wanted her to have those things, but without any official documentation or proof, her arguments fell flat. By the time the trial reached its final stages, Vanessa's confidence had crumbled. She looked exhausted, her once perfectly styled hair now dull and lifeless. Her lawyers had clearly warned her that she was losing, and she was no longer strutting into the courtroom like she owned the place. Daniel, on the other hand, felt a growing sense of satisfaction. He had stayed quiet through most of the proceedings, letting his lawyers handle the fight, but now that victory was within reach, he wanted to be there to see it. On the last day of the trial, Vanessa made one final attempt to plead her case. She took the stand and launched into an emotional speech about how much she had loved Richard, how she had taken care of him, and how she had been robbed of the life they had planned together. She wiped away fake tears, glancing at the judge, as if hoping for something. But the judge remained unmoved. In the final ruling, the court dismissed Vanessa's claims entirely. The trust remained intact, and she was awarded nothing from Richard's assets. The only thing she was entitled to was a small sum from his personal bank account, an amount so insignificant compared to what she had been expecting that it might as well have been nothing. The eviction notice was finalized as well. Vanessa was given 2 weeks to vacate the mansion. If she refused, law enforcement would forcibly remove her. Daniel watched her reaction carefully as the judge read the verdict. For a moment, Vanessa sat frozen, her face pale. Then, as the realization hit her, her expression twisted into pure rage. "This isn't over," she spat under her breath as she walked past Daniel outside the courtroom. "You think you've won, but you'll regret this." Daniel just smiled. "No, Vanessa, you lost, and you have no one to blame but yourself." She stormed out without another word. Later that evening, Daniel sat in his father's mansion, the Carter mansion. It was officially his now, just as his father had intended. As he walked through the halls, he could almost feel Richard's presence, as if his father had been watching the entire ordeal and nodding in approval. "You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you, Dad?" Daniel muttered, shaking his head with a small smile. Richard had been a businessman until the very end. He had planned for everything, ensuring that the people he cared about were taken care of and that those who only saw him as a payday got nothing. And in the end, Vanessa had played herself. The following weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and finalizing the details of Richard's estate. Vanessa's bitter attempts to undermine Daniel's position had faltered, and for the first time in months, Daniel could finally breathe without the weight of her threats looming over him. Yet something inside him remained unsettled. He had won, yes, but he hadn't expected it to feel like this. The mansion was his now. The business his. Everything his father had worked so hard for was in his hands. He had been named the sole beneficiary of the trust, and the legacy of Richard Carter, wealthy businessman, philanthropist, and an often distant but caring father, was now his responsibility to carry forward. But even though the battle with Vanessa had ended in his favor, Daniel found himself wondering if this was really what his father had wanted for him. There had been no love lost between Daniel and his stepmother, and their history together was complicated. His father's marriage to Vanessa had been a surprise to everyone who knew them, including Daniel. When Richard announced he was getting married for the second time, no one had expected Vanessa to be the one. She was much younger than Richard, and her social life seemed more about expensive jewelry and lavish vacations than anything resembling genuine affection. Daniel had never trusted her, and now, seeing her try to take what wasn't hers, his instincts had been proven right. But now that the dust had settled, Daniel could feel a nagging sense of unease creeping in. His father's passing, though not entirely unexpected, had left an undeniable hole in his life. He wasn't a sentimental person, but the absence of Richard was harder to bear than he had anticipated. There had been times, growing up, when Richard's distant manner had frustrated him, but in the end, Richard had been his father. Daniel spent the next few days sifting through the various legal documents related to the estate. There were properties to be sold, investments to be moved, and charitable contributions to be honored. All of it required careful attention. However, as he reviewed the legal paperwork, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still amiss. Vanessa had been a distraction, but there were too many loose ends, too many questions unanswered. One evening, as he flipped through some of his father's old correspondence, a letter caught his attention. It was addressed to him, but it was postmarked just weeks before Richard's death. Curious, Daniel opened the envelope, finding a single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was unmistakable, his father's familiar scrawl. But the words were different from anything Daniel had expected. "Daniel, I know you don't want to hear from me right now, but there's something you need to know. I've made mistakes. I've been far from the perfect father, but this is something I need to leave for you. There are things about the estate that are complicated, more than you might realize. I don't want to burden you with this now, but I'm hoping you'll understand when the time comes. Take care of it, and don't let anyone take advantage of you, not even me. With love, Dad." The letter didn't explain much, but it raised new questions. Richard had made mistakes? What did that mean? And why, after all these years, had he written such an enigmatic note? The phrase, "take care of it," echoed in Daniel's mind. It felt like there was something more he needed to discover. The next morning, Daniel called Mr. Hawthorne, the attorney who had been handling the estate since Richard's passing. When he explained the letter, Hawthorne's response was one of concern mixed with caution. "Daniel, this is the first I'm hearing about such a letter," Hawthorne said, his voice tense. "If your father left behind any other instructions, they weren't mentioned in the will or the trust." "I'm not sure if it's important," Daniel admitted, trying to sound casual. "But it sounds like there's more to the estate than we've uncovered." Hawthorne sighed. "It could be a personal matter, Daniel, something unrelated to the estate, but if you want, I'll look into it. I'll have my office dig through any other documents we may have missed, just to be thorough." The attorney's words offered some reassurance, but Daniel couldn't help feeling like he was on the verge of a deeper mystery. He spent the following days reviewing the contents of the letter over and over, searching for any clue, any hint that would shed light on his father's intentions. A few days later, Hawthorne called with news. "I've found something," he said, sounding more serious than before. "There's an old safe deposit box in one of the local banks. Richard had it in his name, but the access was restricted. The bank records show he listed you as the secondary contact, with full access to the box upon his death." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "What's in the box?" "We don't know yet. We're going to open it tomorrow morning. If you want to be there, I suggest you come by." Daniel didn't hesitate. He cleared his schedule and arranged to meet with Hawthorne the following morning at the bank. His curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of urgency, pushed him to drive across town. As he approached the bank, his mind raced with possibilities. What had Richard hidden away? The process of accessing the safe deposit box was simple, but the anticipation was unbearable. The clerk led them down a sterile hallway to a small, dimly lit room where the box was stored. The box was old and unmarked, its keys locked inside a small drawer with a matching number. After a few moments, the box was opened, and Daniel peered inside. The contents were minimal, just a few old documents, a handful of photographs, and something that made Daniel's blood run cold. A small envelope, carefully sealed with a wax stamp. With trembling hands, Daniel tore open the envelope. Inside there was a letter. This one, unlike the first, was formal and written in a hand that was clearly strained, as if his father had written it in a rush. "Daniel," it began, "I never wanted you to know about this, but it's time you understood the full truth. Vanessa was never just a gold digger. She's not the real threat, and you're not the only one she was after. I made deals I regret, ones that went beyond the scope of what you know. There are hidden assets, beyond what's in the trust, that could destroy everything we've worked for. They're buried, both literally and figuratively, and only you can find them. But be careful, Daniel. There are others who will be after it, people you don't know. Protect yourself, and protect the family name. This is my final confession." Daniel's hands shook as he read the letter twice. His father had been hiding something big, and now Daniel was left with the impossible task of figuring out what it was. "What does this mean?" Daniel asked, his voice tight. Hawthorne, who had been watching him closely, didn't say a word. Instead, he motioned for Daniel to hand him the letter. As he read it, his face grew pale. "This complicates things," Hawthorne muttered. "I had no idea your father had made such arrangements. This changes everything." The next few weeks were a blur of investigation. Daniel, with Hawthorne's help, tried to piece together the clues his father had left behind. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, influence, and old family secrets. The estate wasn't the end of Richard's legacy. It was the beginning of something much more dangerous. Vanessa, for all her faults, had been right about one thing. There was more to Richard Carter's life than anyone had realized. And now it was up to Daniel to decide whether he would expose those secrets or bury them forever. But as the search continued, Daniel realized that some answers might come at a price he wasn't willing to pay. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous the game became. It seemed that every answer only led to more questions. The final decision, as his father had warned him, was his to make. And so, as the estate continued to unravel, Daniel stood at a crossroads, staring at a future that was as uncertain as it was thrilling. One thing was clear. He had won the battle with Vanessa, but the war was far from over. The true legacy of Richard Carter was just beginning to reveal itself, and Daniel was now its reluctant heir.